Hello and welcome to Composer's Lab. Session 8, Giuseppe Verdi. We're very glad to see you here. What you just heard was a rendition of his triumphal march from the opera Aida. Aida was composed for the opening of the opera house in Egypt, Cairo, Egypt. And that was the inaugural piece to be performed, a special opera with the Egyptian theme. And this march reflects, of course, the Italian opera traditions, as well as some of the North African motifs that Giuseppe Verdi was introduced to when he was researching for this opera. Giuseppe Verdi is considered the father and the grandfather of opera in Italy. There were many composers before him, but not only he had a tremendously long life of 98 years, but he also helped set the trends not only in Italy, but also in France, and perhaps even influenced the German composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, who was active in France and working in the Grand Opera. Giuseppe Verdi, here's what he looks like, and his full name would be pronounced Giuseppe Fortunino Francesco Verdi. As we said, he had a very long life. He was born in 1813, died in 1901, just over the mark of the 20th century. I like this portrait because, well, it's a contemporary portrait, and there are many portraits that we see where he looks very stern. In this one, he's actually very friendly. He almost looks like a grandfather of something, and you know, he was actually a very interesting person, as we know. He was really very active throughout his entire life, and really worked with a tremendous number of people and set up tremendous number of theater productions. Here is another portrait of Verdi. Now, this one is also very friendly, but this one is almost like inquisitive, I guess. Like he's almost asking us, so, you see what I'm doing? What do you think? I think it's pretty good. And what I'd like to show you of portraits of Verdi is this very interesting discovery that I made here on the internet. Now, we all have seen perhaps this portrait here. This is the work of Giovanni Boldini, and it was done in 1886, so towards the end of Verdi's life. It is on display in Italy, but what I didn't know is when we see this portrait, we normally see it in textbooks, but look at the close-up of the portrait here. this is pretty fascinating. What appears to be almost a photograph-like rendition in the close-up reveals that it was done with perhaps some sort of pastel-like technique. And you will see all of these highlights of white. And of course, you see all the other highlights. And when you look at the picture, I personally cannot believe that this and that is the same. And by the way, there is an attribution to this picture. It is posted on Wiki Commons, and it belongs to the Italian government, and the government actually asks that we give them the credit for releasing this close-up photograph of what they consider a national treasure monument of the Italian nation. So we're very thankful to Wiki Commons and the government of Italy for letting us get a glimpse into something like this. Now, Verdi was a child prodigy, like many composers that we know of that made a mark on the history of music. He started learning music early. He was quickly discovered as somebody who can play the organ and sing, and even tried his hand at the composition. And unfortunately, we cannot find these compositions. They have been lost, but they had been written when he was a kid. And then at some point, he was sent to study in Milano, the city of Milan. Now, that would be northern Italy. And of course, we know Milan as the home of La Scala, or Teatro de Scala. Now, the theater had been there already when Verdi was growing up, so it was only natural that he was exposed to the great work of other composers, such as, in time, Rossini's music. And then later on, of course, this would be the home of many, many stagings of Verdi's operas themselves. This is a modern picture of La Scala. Now, again, we're using the images that are copyright-free, posted on Wiki Commons by various photographers, and we acknowledge their participation in the Creative Commons license attribution. So this is La Scala, and pretty much has not changed over these centuries. And this is what it looks like today inside the theater. Now, me being from Moscow, Russia, I can tell you that Moscow has what we know Bolshoi Theater, and it looks very much like this. You see the boxes on the sides, you know, several levels, several tiers of the boxes. The idea is, of course, that each family or a certain group will rent a box, and of course the biggest box would be for the main dignitaries that would be seated right across perhaps where the picture was taken from. And then of course you see the orchestra pit down below, and you can also see that it's not that large, the orchestra pit. So conceivably the orchestras for the theater, even in Verdi's times, were not that large, and today we actually sometimes have larger orchestras than that, but if you see the number of chairs, it's really just enough to get the point across. Now, the kinds of productions that would be shown in these theaters, let's just look at some of the contemporary artwork that depicts some of these sets and the characters and their costumes. For instance, here is a rendition of the scene from Verdi's opera Don Carlos. Now you can see how elaborate the sets are. It really does look like today's cinema movie set, right? You see all the props, you see all the fabrics, you see the candles, and that's pretty much how it was. If today's Hollywood is the standard of high-end, you know, large-scale, expensive production perhaps, then opera back then was that medium. Lots of people work on each production. The composer is really just a composer of the music. Now, here's another slide from the same opera, Don Carlos. Now you see for each act, of course, they will change the complete scenery, roll out the other set and roll in the new sets, and these are all, you know, real wooden sets, of course. You know, there's no drawing really in these. These are all real decorations. And here's another one that I really like. This is, again, from his opera Aida that was written for the Cairo theater opening. And you can see just the tremendous forces that were used in these kinds of productions, and of course the tremendous sets. So everything was really to dazzle and amaze, and of course make people want to pay, you know, the big bucks, as they say today, to come and see an event like this, especially when it's a premiere of a new work by somebody like Verdi. Now we know that Rossini was a great opera composer in Italy, and then towards the end of Verdi's life, there was also Puccini, who made a huge impact on the music. And again, when we look at them from today's perspective, we can see that some of the trends that they set for show production, for structuring the music, and for, you know, combining the dialogue, which in this case would be what they call recitativo, so it's half sung, really. Right, it's written as musical notes, but they're kind of almost like what the crooners use in their technique, kind of just sung very lightly and short. And then the aria, of course, would be where each character expresses their own thoughts and feelings and desires. And then there would be choral scenes with the choir, and then, of course, there would be ensembles, which include several people when they either talk to each other or they argue, which happens a lot in opera. Of course, there's no opera if there's no drama. Really, there has to be some sort of a conflict and the protagonist and all of that. So the point is that all of these trends and techniques were later used in the 20th century, and especially when we think of modern Broadway shows, right? Smaller orchestra. Nowadays on Broadway, it's very common to see, let's say, just 4 or 5 wind instrument players, and each one would double or triple on several instruments as the setting requires. For instance, a flute player might switch to the clarinet in the middle of the show, or all of them might just take saxophones and start playing. So the same concepts as they were developed back then in the heyday of opera, if you will, as the main entertainment medium of a big scale, they also migrated to Hollywood, of course, to not just Hollywood, but cinematic expression as well. You know, some of the operas are very mainstream, like Verdi's, and some other operas would be more sort of artistic and perhaps experimental, and the same way as we find in cinema today. Now, what I'd like to do now is, we have a special guest here today. Alexandra Vargas, please join us here on the stage. Alexandra is a vocalist. We've already had the privilege of have her here for the Schubert program in the Composers Lab. And today we're prepared a few things with Alexandra, and we're going to start with this medley of several arias. And Alexandra, please just tell us about each one as we are ready to do it, and we'll hear little snippets of different genres or different kinds of plots from Verdi's operas.
Okay, thank you again for having me on your show. And today we are going to start with Caro Nome from the opera Rigoletto. We will talk specifically about the plot later on, but for now it is an aria sung by the character called Gilda, and she is young and impressionable, and she has lived a very sheltered life. And in this aria, she sings how she has fallen in love with someone, and how dear his name is to her, and that it causes her heart to palpitate. next opera, Un Ballo in Mascara, The Masked Ball, actually has two versions, one set in Sweden and another in Boston. And the story tells of a nobleman, or in this case, if it's set in Boston, probably of a social guy, who's having a masked ball, and he's delighted when he reads the invitation list and sees that Amelia, the woman he's in love with, is coming. But the problem is Amelia is married to somebody else, and her husband finds out that the main character, Renato, is in love with her. So he hatches a plan to murder the host of this party, but he cannot figure out who he is because it's a masked ball and they're all in disguises. So my character is actually a travesty role, which is a woman dressed as a man. So I'm a woman who's playing a man's part. In this case, he is a boy, a teenager named Oscar. And he knows who's wearing what costume because he helps the nobleman out. But he will not tell the jealous husband, not because he knows that he has the intent to kill, but because he likes keeping the secret to himself. Verdi was also a very big fan of Shakespeare's, and many of his operas are actually Shakespeare plays. For example, Macbeth and Falstaff. This aria is from Falstaff, and it is the only comedy that Verdi wrote. And the character of Falstaff comes from Henry V, and he is Henry V's mentor. He's an older knight. He's a soldier, he's a brave man, but he also has a lot of vices. He's constantly broke, he drinks too much, and he's a womanizer. In this opera, the comedy that focuses solely on his character, he is already getting older and he's broke and he wants a quick way to make money. And he hatches the plan to try to seduce two rich married women, Meg Page and Anne Ford, to somehow try to get their money. But these ladies, of course, figure out his plan and create a bigger plan to make a fool of Falstaff. So Nanetta is one of the wives' daughters, and the three of them create this elaborate plan at night to confuse Falstaff. So they're pretending to be nymphs, and in this aria, Nanetta is dressed as a nymph, and she is singing an aria telling all the other costumed people to dance and carry on. Our last piece, Sempre Libre, comes from probably one of his most famous operas, La Traviata. And in this piece, the title character sings how she is always free and that the point of life is to go from joy to joy.
And by the way, what we're looking at graphics-wise is the title page of the piano reduction, in other words, what we call the vocal score. So this was the first edition of the what people would normally get for their home use, if you will, right? The orchestra part is transcribed for the piano, and that's what we're going to be looking at again, as all the other ones. So here it is.
Nasca il giorno muoia, sempre lieta ne ritrovi. Ad idee sempre nuovi, di volare il mio pensier, volare il mio pensier,
Actually, Alfredo answers, amor, 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 e palpito, heartbeat. Of course, he sings this a whole octave higher than a composer like me could. But this gives you a good idea of what Verdi's writing was like. So, first thing that we notice, of course, is his melodies. Now, this is something that people really strive for today, is creating a memorable melody or hook for a song, for instance. But in those times, basically each opera has at least one or more so-called hits. And then the hits at that time would not be something that's printed on phonograph records or streamed online. The hits would be the tunes that people whistle and sing on the street, or in the cafe, or at home, or walking out of the theater, if they remember the tune. In fact, some of those operas, he was so secretive about the main aria, like in Rigoletto, I've read the story that he would not show the main aria for Duke to anybody, including the performer. He basically said, there is this aria, but nobody is to know the aria until our dress rehearsal. And so when the dress rehearsal happened, he finally unveiled the aria, and what we call today, there was no leakage of information, right? So people actually heard the aria for the very first time, including the production staff, at the show. Now, what's interesting, Alexandra, is when we talk about opera and the techniques, the vocal techniques that are used, if I understand correctly, there is such a term as, of course, coloratura, right, which is all those high rolls, in the high range, but there is also fioritura, and that's a cool word, right? Has to do with, well, flourishing is the good English word that translates it, but also flurries, as in, something shiny and sparkly and festive. Right? So as a vocalist, Alexandra, how would you describe the what it takes to actually sing these operas, let's say as a high voice, soprano or tenor would be the high voices of female and male, respectively. How could you describe this?
Well, yes, Verdi does come from the bel canto school, which is the school of beautiful singing, which originated in Italy. And what it takes to sing this, first of all, good breath control, because for high notes and to sustain especially descending scales without going flat, you need a lot of control in order to do that.
Right, and that's when they talk about
Appoggio, yeah, which is leaning on the breath, you know, support.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's interesting how in different schools of composition, you know, like when you listen to German opera, it's always kind of darker. It's about the depth of the feeling. And when you hear French operas, it's all about just mad love and also, of course, the grandiosity of what they did in the French opera house, the Opéra de Paris. Giacomo Meyerbeer, you know, Meyerbeer was a German composer with an Italian name who worked in Paris. Go figure, right? But they both actually competed for the Parisian scene, Verdi and Meyerbeer. And in reality, Verdi was so famous that whatever he produced for the French opera, he would later revise. As a matter of fact, second half of his life, a lot of the years were spent not writing new compositions, but revising the French-based operas to be sort of domesticated for the Italian market, and premiered right there at La Scala again. We have a very special treat for you today. Of course, we would like to have a whole orchestra here. We would like to have a whole stage full of characters and props. But when we were thinking of how we could present some of the majestic quality of Verdi's writing and what he does for the vocals, we actually thought up of recording a separate, we would call it package in television, so it's a little program within a program. And what we did, we got together with some of our friends who are vocalists, and we went to a local company called Florida Film and Tape here in Orlando, and they have a sound stage there that looks like a black box theater. And so we stood as a sort of a semicircle, distanced as we were, and we introduced some of the finest writing, perhaps, the famous quartet from the opera Rigoletto by Verdi. Now, Alexandra, perhaps we could tell the story of Rigoletto, the opera plot. I know that it starts with Rigoletto being the court jester, and that he is pretty much mocked by all the other courtiers in the court, and that they pretty much want him dead or whatnot. And then there's also his daughter, and that's where the plot takes off.
That's right. So Rigoletto, the title character, is a court jester. He actually works for the Duke, and he is hunchbacked and he's very unattractive, but he is extremely good at making fun of people. So this is great for the Duke and for Rigoletto, because this gives him his job, but it earns him a lot of enemies at court. So Rigoletto has this young daughter, Gilda, my character, who he keeps secret, and courtiers find out about her. And they also find out that the Duke, who is a womanizer and he is obsessed with chasing every skirt he sees, has been secretly pursuing her. He's been watching her walk from her house to church every day, and she also has fallen in love with him, even though the Duke has lied about his identity. So the courtiers decide to kidnap Gilda and get the Duke together, who afterwards seduces her to get back at Rigoletto. When Rigoletto finds out, he hires Scorafuggio, I think I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but so. Yes, and his sister, Maddalena, to lure the Duke into the cabin and then later murder him. But before that, he wants to prove to Gilda that the Duke is a bad man. So Maddalena lures him into the cabin, she flirts with him, and he has Gilda watch from a distance. And of course, her heart is broken. that she finds out his true character. But then she stays and overhears the rest of the plot, that they want to murder the Duke after the Duke leaves. But Maddalena decides, we should just probably murder the first person who enters the tavern, and send Rigoletto that body. So Gilda decides to sacrifice herself for her love and cross-dresses as a man and enters the tavern first, and they nearly kill her because she still has to sing a duet with Rigoletto at the end. So she's still alive when they bring her to her father, and they sing a heartbreaking ending together.
Yeah, isn't it something? No happy Hollywood ending in most of
Only
these
tragedy.
operas. Almost everybody dies, almost like there's one version of Shakespeare's Hamlet to where they say the shortest version, basically everybody just enters the stage, stands up, and everybody just rolls to the floor and says, and they all died. That's kind of how these operas go a lot of times. Now, for this performance, we had 4 characters, as Alexandra said. She is singing the part of Gilda, who is the daughter of Rigoletto. Gilda is a soprano. Rigoletto is a baritone, so pretty much low male voice. And then the other participants here, of course, and the scene actually starts with them. So what you will hear in this is, first, there is a short kind of a setup. It's almost like the scene starts, and then we know what's going on here. And then when the Duke actually confesses his so-called love to Maddalena, of course, there's this whole game of deceit going on. You know, some people know what's going on, some only partially know what's going on, some think that they know what's going on, but they don't. And as you hear the quartet, which we're going to hear very soon, in just less than a minute, you will hear how when the quartet itself starts with Duke's confession and Maddalena answers, you will hear the different parts. And before we sing it, the vocalists are actually going to not only introduce themselves, but introduce their part. And we're going to show you what these parts are, these different segments or different layers, if you will, of the whole fabric. And then you will hear the entire piece. So if we're ready, let's fire off that video. We are here at the Florida Film and Tape soundstage, and we're going to present the quartet from the opera Rigoletto by Verdi. Let's have these fine performers each introduce themselves and tell us about their part and how it fits into the quartet.
Hello, my name is Jose Cimerilla Romero, and I'm singing the role of Duke of Mantua. The Duke of Mantua is today's modern playboy. His objective or goal throughout the whole opera is to seduce, to lie to lay with, and in the end cheat and abandon women. Throughout this whole opera, his new victim is Gilda. Unfortunately for her, he fills her with false promises of love, of true love, of relationship, of an eternal togetherness. But at the end, we see that he's just lying to her, and tragically, he does abandon her. In this scene, at the end of the quartet, he sings to his next victim, Maddalena, and he begins with the words, Bella figlia dell'amore, beautiful daughter of love, slave you are to your deities. With one word and one word only, you could just fade away all my pains. And the melody that begins this quartet goes a little like this. Bella figlia dell'amore, schiavo son de vezzi tuoi, qual un netto sol tuo puoi, le mie pene consolar.
Hello, my name is Loriana Intili, And I sing here as a mezzo-soprano, and I sing the part of Maddalena. And Maddalena is hired actually to seduce the Duke in this part. And she knows that this is all a joke, and so she's laughing about him singing the love for her. And she appreciates it, but she knows that it's a joke. And her part does a little like this.
Rido bendicore che te vai e costa poco. Quanto valga il vostro gioco, me credete su apprezzar.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Vargas, and I am singing the role of Gilda. Gilda is Rigoletto's daughter, and she's young, and she's impressionable and innocent, and at the start of the opera, she is seduced by the Duke as revenge on the Duke's part for Rigoletto making fun of him at court. In this scene, Gilda and her father stumble across the Duke seducing Maddalena. And Gilda is absolutely heartbroken. She's having heart palpitations, and this part, infelice cor tradito, unhappy broken heart, is what she sings when this is going on.
Infelice cor tradito per angoscia non scoppiare. Infelice cor tradito per angoscia non scoppiare.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Cavalcante, and I am playing the title character, Rigoletto. Rigoletto is a court jester, and in this scene, he is reassuring Gilda that the vengeance will be taken, and he will carry out this vengeance for the Duke hurting my beautiful daughter, Gilda. And throughout the quartet, he's constantly repeating the same lines, I will have vengeance for you, I will have vengeance for you, and it kind of sounds a little something like this. Tace mia sarà la cura, la vendetta da frettar. Tace mia sarà la cura, la vendetta da frettar.
Thank you. And now, let's perform the famous quartet from the opera Rigoletto by Giuseppe Verdi.
Se ben rammentami, o bella t'incontrai, mi piacque di te chiedere, e in te su que mi stai, or sapi que valore, sol te quest'alma d'ora.
E vent'anni appresso, le sorda forse adesso, ha un'aria da signore.
E che fracasso!
Stia saggio!
E tu si docile, non farmi tanto chiaso! Ogni saggezza chiudesi nel gaudio e nell'amore. La bella mano candida.
Scherzate o voi, signore?
Non ho.
Son brutta.
Abbracci.
E
d'amore ardente.
Signor l'indifferente, vi piace canzonar?
Non otivo sposar.
Ne voglio la parola.
Amabile figliola.
E non ti basta ancor.
Ne voglio traditor.
E non ti basta ancor.
Ne voglio traditor.
E non ti basta ancor. E non ti basta ancor.
Bella figlia dell'amore, schiavo son de vezzi tuoi, con un detto sol, te poi le e senti del mio cuore il frequente palpitar con un detto sol tu puoi le mie pene consolar.
Rido bendicore che te baia costa poco.
Così parlar d'amore.
Quanto valga il vostro gioco, me credete so apprezzar.
Ahimè pur l'infamio Dio.
Taci, il piangere non vale. Taci, il piangere non vale.
Il vostro gioco so apprezzar. Il vostro gioco so apprezzar.
Okay, well, that was real opera, guys. Thank you, Alexandra. Bravissima.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this. Now, we normally have an open forum with interactive guests, but today what we actually did, we had all of these fine singers as our guests. So this, I should say, concludes the presentation portion of this Composer's Lab, Session 8, Verdi. And now our open discussion will be with Alexandra again. So now that we've heard the piece, let's examine what we just heard. All right, so first of all, you hear the galloping rhythm of this. Now, a successful song of any time, really any genre, if you think about it, is usually something that's either deeply felt, soulful, or something that's danceable, something that makes you want to move. And pretty much you remember it as a dance groove. So in this case, it's a gallop, right? But the vocal parts, when the singers introduce them, you'll hear that they're all totally different in the way that they're written musically. For instance, of course, the Duke's part is the biggest bel canto aria, right? And then Maddalena, being as wicked as she is in her character, she almost sings like she talks, you know. She doesn't really waste much breath there. She just says, ah, ha, 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 right? Whatever. And then Gilda, of course, is heartbroken over this. So her lines are based more on sort of a motif of a sigh, you know, ah, 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 right? Something like this. Right, so she's constantly just going, oh no, musically, right? And then Rigoletto, being the father, his attitude in this is see what happens. So his intonations are more like fanfare, pa, 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 you know, that kind of fanfare, like, you see, I told you, or I will seek revenge, you know, he keeps repeating that, of course. So Alexandra, when you work in a theater production, let's say, how do you usually see this being approached? You know, how would, let's say, a director coach the different actors in something like this, where you have all these different characters doing the same things? What is your experience in that?
How do they put the scene together?
Right. In other words, the idea is for everybody to blend, but also you want to have these different attitudes expressed, right? So how, in your experience when you were doing theater, you know, what did directors do to make that happen?
That is the genius of Verdi, so it's form and function. So every character musically has their own intention, but you also have to portray this when you're acting as well, and at the same time keep the whole thing together. So of course we rehearse the scenes first, we rehearse them musically, make sure every part works together, and then of course you have to act it and sing it with intention. So actually the music does dictate the blocking as well. So if characters are singing together and their parts are overlaying, they're usually, you know, their blocking accompanies that. So they're together, and we always make sure that we are watching each other for intention and as well as to keep the ensemble going.
Right. Blocking, by the way, same term used in film as well as theater. It's basically how the different people are perceived from the vantage point of the audience, right? So let's say if these people are here and then these people approach from this side, and do they come near them? Do they overlap, you know, in relationship to each other and in relationship to the set pieces? Right. That was very, very interesting observation that blocking is a part of the music, in fact. And
it's actually tricky in opera because unlike in perhaps film or maybe even stage productions, you can never face the back or make sure your back face the audience because you can't be heard. And you always need to place yourself in a way that you're seen by your scene partner because you're singing together, and that you're not singing in front of them so they can't hear you or behind them. So that's actually interesting how that affects how opera is blocked as well.
Yeah, that's true, because of course, as we know nowadays, a lot of shows that we see are done with microphones. You know, Broadway is done with either hidden lavalier mics here or sometimes hair microphones that are invisible inside the hairdo. But real opera has and always is done live acoustically. So the theater acoustics actually amplify the vocalist's voice, and you know, the bigger the pipes you have, the more famous you will be, the more money you will make, the more people can hear you. As far as blocking goes, it's very interesting, right? Because sometimes you even see those stage productions that are done as movie for TV, and like in those, they can actually do have a lot more freedom. And also, I think this is not related to music really, but it's also related to theater, is how makeup is done. I just know that, for instance, theater makeup is more about bigger features, you know. So if somebody's character is an angry person, you know, they'll have these eyebrows done a certain way, right? But for instance, when you do film or you do opera for film, then you cannot use that kind of makeup, and it looks more like actual real people makeup. Alexandra, So when you read, when you first study an opera piece like Verdi's or perhaps even French opera, so how do you approach the studying of it? Nowadays, we have all these different recordings, right? And if you hear one version, it'll be one thing. You hear this other version, it'll be another thing. People in 1940s, for instance, sang opera differently than they sang it in 1980s. And today, they sing it yet differently from all of the above. So when you approach it in terms of style, what is your point of reference? Do you try to go by a certain version you like? Do you try to go by what you think the composer had in mind? How do you do that?
Well, actually, I try to watch as many versions as I can because you're right, every version is different. And in order to get a better sense of what you would like to bring to the piece and maybe what the composer intended, it's good to listen to a variety of versions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, to me, sometimes, you know, I'm just going to give you an example in just my musical life. There is a sonata by Edvard Grieg, Norwegian composer of 19th century, who was actually highly endorsed by Tchaikovsky and is now Norwegian national treasure as a work of art. But he wrote this sonata for the piano. And then later, when he became sort of famous, fame caught up with him, he was a rather old age already, and I think it was RCA Victor that made a contract with him to record some of his piano music or some of his piano transcriptions. One of those recordings is that sonata. And I played that sonata. I played it as a kid. You know, I still play it. Sometimes I'll include the entire sonata as juxtaposed with some other sonata, like a Beethoven sonata. Say, here's a Beethoven sonata, and here's a romantic sonata by Grieg. But you know, I have never heard that recording, even though I know it exists. I'm almost scared to hear that recording. And you know why? Because I think that the idea that I have of Grieg's piece goes with what I think Grieg wanted. So when I hear what he really wanted, I don't know. I think I might just have a heart attack because I know for sure it's going to be different. Now, you know, Verdi didn't have recordings, but let's say Sergei Rachmaninoff did, you know. And so, for instance, some of Rachmaninoff's concertos I have heard as a kid as recorded by the composer himself with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Those were famous series of their recording collaborations with both Eugene Ormandy conducting and Leopold Stokowski. And so as a kid, I got used to, you know, Rachmaninoff's version. It's very difficult for me to step away from that, Alexandra. So now when that happens to you, for instance, in this quartet, in Rigoletto quartet, there's a part there goes like this. Right? So, I mean, there's a way, for instance, to slow down a lot during that, and just for practical reasons too, so that those really, really high notes can actually be felt through and sort of landed as opposed to just sliding between them quickly, right? But then, yeah, it's a matter of taste, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a matter of taste. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned older recordings because over the years, actually pitch changed. So we are playing and singing slightly higher than we were in the past. So that also affects technique and the way we would perform a quartet like this. Because for the soprano and for the tenor, it's actually slightly higher than it was when it was written in Verdi's time.
Wow, you're so right. As a matter of fact, in Mozart's times, the pitch was even lower. So like some of those, the Queen of the Night, you know, it would have been more like in Mozart's times, in his pitch standard. And by the way, how we know these things? Because we have tuning forks from those times, from different countries. And of course, before ANSI and all those fancy organizations that standardize all the measurement units in the world, before those, every county almost had its own standard, and the general trend always is bigger, better, faster, more and more and more. And so as a result, the instruments were made to be more robust. The strings were stronger on the string instruments. The piano frames were stronger. They were cast iron. And so as a result, I think, Yeah, we're modernizing.
Yeah, volume and pitch, both of them increased.
And we're pretty much modernizing everything at any given point, you know, as the times move. Well, this has been a really great presentation. Alexandra,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for participating in the quartet.
Again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And this concludes Session 8 of Composer's Lab, Giuseppe Verdi. We're very happy to have you here. I hope you learned a lot about Italian opera and how it's done back in the day and in today's day. And on behalf of the Interactive Academy, we wish you happy composing.